It was the first Saturday of November, 1974. One of those northern Minnesota mornings that comes in cold and still, and smells like wood smoke and frozen ground. The kind of morning that people who grew up in Itasca County carry in their memory as the specific smell of deer season. Coffee before 5, boots on the porch, the trees bare and gray against a sky that hadn't fully decided on its color yet. Frank and Dennis Pilarski had been hunting the same stretch of Chippewa National Forest land outside Deer River for 11 consecutive years, since Frank was 23 and Dennis was 19. And the trip had become the kind of ritual that organizes a year around itself. Their wives knew the weekend. Their children knew the weekend. The neighbors knew when the truck would be gone and when it would come back. Frank was 34 that November. Dennis was 30. Frank ran a heating and cooling business out of Deer River. Dennis drove a school bus for the Grand Rapids district and did small engine repair in his garage on weekends. They were not dramatic men. They were useful men. The kind that a small Minnesota town is built around without always knowing it. The men who show up when a furnace goes out in January or a neighbor's truck won't start before dawn. They had driven out of Deer River at 4:45 in the morning in Frank's 1969 Ford F-250, dark blue, with their gear in the bed and a thermos of coffee between the front seats, and they had waved at Dennis's wife Carol from the driveway. They never waved from that driveway again. The truck was recovered from a drainage ditch off Forest Road 2163 on November 12, 1974. 5 days after Frank and Dennis had been reported missing. It was upright, its hood nosed into the earthen bank, the front axle submerged. The thermos was still in the cab. 2 rifles were in the bed. The engine had been off long enough that investigators could not determine how long it had been in the ditch from the cooling pattern alone, and there was standing water in the floor that complicated the interior evidence. Frank and Dennis were not in the truck. They were not anywhere near the truck. The forest absorbed them and gave back nothing. For 49 years, it gave back nothing. Then, in the spring of 2023, a forensic engineering team contracted by the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension began a systematic materials analysis of the F-250's recovered components using spectroscopic techniques developed for aerospace failure investigation that had not existed in 1974. And what the truck's frame and its steering column and its brake lines told that team, told them with the precision of physical law, which does not lie and does not forget, finally answered the question that Itasca County had carried for nearly half a century. Deer River, Minnesota, sits at the edge of the Chippewa National Forest in Itasca County, a community of a few thousand people organized around the timber industry, the tourist economy of the lake country, and the particular character of northern Minnesota small-town life in the mid-1970s. CB radios in the trucks, Lutheran church on Sunday, high school hockey as a civic religion, and the forest as both a working landscape and a geographic fact that shaped everything about how people moved through the world. The trees were everywhere. The lakes were everywhere. The roads into the national forest were narrow and seasonal and understood by the people who used them with the familiarity of long practice. The Pilarski family had been in Itasca County since the 1930s, when their grandfather had come from Poland to work the timber. Frank and Dennis's father, Wislav, known as Wes, had built the house on Tamarack Road where both boys had grown up, and had run a small hardware store in Deer River for 25 years before his knees gave out, and he handed the counter over to a nephew. Frank had inherited his father's mechanical aptitude and his mother's organizational mind and had applied them to the heating business, which he had built from a part-time side operation in 1965 to a full-service company with 3 employees by 1974. Dennis had inherited his father's patience and his grandfather's capacity for silence, which was not unfriendliness, but rather the quality of a man who had decided that the world generally said enough already without his adding to it. Frank was married to a woman named Helen, and they had 2 daughters, ages 9 and 6. Dennis was married to Carol, and they had a son named Michael who was 4. The 2 families lived 4 miles apart on the same road and had Sunday dinner together most weeks and did not need to discuss this because it had simply always been the arrangement. The annual November hunting trip was not the only time Frank and Dennis spent together, but it was the most deliberate time, the weekend that existed specifically because they had decided it should exist, because it was theirs in a way that the ordinary texture of shared lives was not. They had a spot on the National Forest land that they had been using since 1963, accessed by Forest Road 2163, where it crossed a seasonal drainage. They had shot deer in that spot. They had also, on at least 2 documented occasions, spent the entire weekend without shooting anything and come home in good spirits regardless. The morning they drove away from Dennis's driveway on November 2nd, 1974, was a Saturday, and Frank had the thermos, and Dennis had the sandwiches, and the truck had a full tank of gas and new front tires that Frank had put on the previous week. And there was nothing about any of it that should have been the last time. Carol Pilarski called Helen Pilarski on Sunday evening, November 3rd, when neither Frank nor Dennis had returned by 6 o'clock and had not called, which was not unprecedented. The drive back from that part of the forest could run late depending on conditions, but which Carol, by 9 o'clock, had decided felt wrong in a way she was not going to dismiss. Helen agreed. Frank had said he would be home by 5. Carol called the Itasca County Sheriff's Office at 9:20. She was told that 2 adult men who had not returned from a hunting trip by Sunday evening were not yet within the department's response parameters, but that a welfare check on the forest road could be dispatched in the morning. By Monday morning, the welfare check had found nothing. By Monday afternoon, the Itasca County Sheriff's Office had opened a formal missing persons case. By Monday evening, the National Forest Service had been contacted, and a coordinated search was being organized. The search ran for 5 days across the Chippewa National Forest Road network in the vicinity of Forest Road 2163. 80 volunteers and 12 law enforcement personnel covered the primary access routes and the drainage systems on both sides of the road. On November 7th, a conservation officer working a different drainage 2 miles south found the first piece of evidence. A single hunting boot, size 11, identified by Helen as Frank's, floating in a culvert backflow. The boot was undamaged. It had not been on a foot for some time. On November 12th, the truck was found in the drainage ditch on Forest Road 2163, 1 mile north of where the brothers had intended to park. The ditch was 6 feet deep at that point and filled with seasonal runoff. The truck had gone in nose first at an angle consistent with a loss of directional control. The front axle was in the water. The bed, which rode higher, was mostly clear. The rifles were there. The thermos was there. Frank's boot, the match to the one found in the culvert, was not found in the truck or in the immediate search area. Frank and Dennis Pilarski were not found. Not then. Not in the weeks that followed. Not in the spring when the snow came off the ground and the drainage systems cleared. They were not found. The search was formally suspended in April of 1975. What was documented at the scene, noted in the accident report and in the missing persons file and in the Sheriff's Department supplemental materials, was that the truck's trajectory into the ditch was inconsistent with the speed at which the F-250 would have been traveling on that road at that hour of a dark November morning. The investigating deputy, a man named Roy Strand, noted in his report that the angle of entry suggested the vehicle had been traveling faster than road conditions warranted, and that this was unusual for someone who knew those roads as well as Frank Pilarski did. Deputy Strand filed his observation. He noted that the brake performance of the vehicle had not been evaluated. He recommended a mechanical review. The mechanical review was not conducted. The vehicle was impounded, processed for interior evidence, and then held in the county impound lot, where it remained for 18 months before being transferred to the State Evidence Storage Facility in Bemidji, where it sat in covered storage for 49 years. Roy Strand's observation about the brakes went unfollowed for 49 years too. Sergeant Melvina Hartwell of the Itasca County Sheriff's Office had been with the department for 12 years when she was assigned the Polarski case as part of a 2018 cold case review initiative. And she had the particular quality of a good cold case investigator, which is the ability to treat a 50-year-old file with the same fresh attention you would bring to a case reported that morning. She had reviewed the file in 2018, flagged the brake observation in Deputy Strand's 1974 report, and submitted a request to the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension for a mechanical assessment of the stored vehicle. The request had been approved in principle in 2019, deferred in 2020 due to pandemic-related resource constraints, and finally funded in late 2022 when the BCA's Forensic Services Division received a federal cold case grant that covered exactly the kind of materials analysis Hartwell had been requesting. She had waited 4 years. She was not the first person in this case to wait. Wes Polarski, Frank and Dennis's father, had died in 1989, 15 years after his sons disappeared, without knowing what had happened to them. Their mother, Irina, had died in 1997. Helen Polarski had raised her 2 daughters alone and had, in the way of women who have no choice, built a life that carried the absence in it without being defined by it. Though her daughters knew, and they told their own children, and the absence was a presence in the Polarski family the way it always is when someone is gone without explanation. Carol Polarski had moved to Duluth in 1980 with her son Michael, who was now in his 50s and who had spent his adult life knowing his father's face from photographs and his father's character from the stories of people who had known him. By 2005, 31 years on, the Deer River community had changed enough that many of the people who had known Frank and Dennis personally were elderly or gone. The truck sat in covered storage in Bemidji. The file sat in the cold case archive. By 2018, Hartwell pulled the file and found Roy Strand's note. By 2022, the grant came through. Every case on this channel is built on the belief that physical evidence, properly preserved, properly analyzed, does not expire. If you believe that too, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's get back to Frank and Dennis. The forensic engineering team from the BCA contracted with a private firm that specialized in vehicle failure analysis, the same discipline used to reconstruct commercial aviation accidents and industrial equipment failures, and began their assessment of the F-250 in January 2023. Lead engineer Sandra Kowalski had spent 20 years analyzing mechanical failures in contexts where the physical evidence was the only record of what had happened. And she brought that discipline to the Polarski truck with the methodical patience of someone who understood that a 1969 Ford F-250 stored in covered conditions for nearly 50 years could still tell you things, if you knew how to ask. What she found was in the brake system. The technique used to analyze aged brake components combines metallurgical spectroscopy, which identifies the chemical composition and stress patterns in metal at a molecular level, with fatigue fracture analysis, which traces the propagation of a crack or failure point backward through time to identify whether it was sudden or gradual, accidental or induced. The F-250's brake line had fractured at a fitting on the driver's side front assembly. Metallurgical analysis of the fracture surface showed a pattern that Kowalski's report described in the precise language of engineering as consistent with a deliberate partial incision made prior to the failure event. which would have caused the line to hold under normal low-speed conditions and fail under the pressure of heavy braking. The brake line had been cut. Not all the way. Enough. Someone who knew that Frank Pilarski would drive Forest Road 2163 in the dark on a cold November morning at speed had partially severed the brake line on his truck before that morning began. Kowalski's report went to Sergeant Hartwell in March 2023. Hartwell read it twice. Then she pulled the original case file again, specifically the section containing the names of individuals interviewed in the November 1974 investigation. She was looking for someone with mechanical knowledge, access to the truck, and a connection to the brothers that had been in plain sight in 1974 and had never been treated as significant. She found him on page 14 of the original interview summary. His name was Gerald Toft. He was 41 years old in 1974, a licensed automotive mechanic who operated a repair shop in Deer River and who had serviced Frank Pilarski's F-250 in September of 1974, 6 weeks before the hunting trip. He had been interviewed as part of the standard canvass of people who had recent contact with the vehicle. He had been cooperative and unremarkable. He had not been listed as a person of interest. He was 89 years old in the spring of 2023. He lived in a care facility in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, 22 miles from Deer River. On a Thursday morning in May 2023, Sergeant Hartwell and a BCA special agent drove to Grand Rapids. They had the engineering report. They had the interview from 1974. They had 49 years of what Deputy Roy Strand's brake observation had been waiting to become. Gerald Toft was in the facility's common room when they arrived. He was in a wheelchair. He had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia the previous year, which complicated the interview's evidentiary value and would ultimately shape the prosecutorial decisions that followed. When Hartwell introduced herself and told him why she was there, Tofty looked at the engineering report she placed on the table between them. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, in the flat, declarative register of a man who had run out of the capacity for concealment, that he had wondered when someone would come. He was placed under arrest at the care facility that afternoon. He was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. The Itasca County District Attorney's Office, in consultation with medical evaluators and a court-appointed guardian, determined that Gerald Toft's cognitive state precluded a fair trial. In September 2023, the DA filed a formal case closure citing the engineering evidence, Toft's statement, and additional corroborating evidence developed in the subsequent investigation, including a land dispute between Toft and the Pilarski family that had been documented in county records from 1973 and had never been surfaced in the original investigation. Toft was not prosecuted. He died in the facility in December 2023, 7 months after Hartwell sat across from him in a common room in Grand Rapids. Michael Pilarski, Dennis's son, 4 years old in November 1974, now 53, was at his desk in Duluth when Sergeant Hartwell called. He had spent 49 years not knowing what had happened to his father on a hunting trip in the Chippewa National Forest. He had grown up with photographs and stories and the specific, unresolvable grief of a child who loses a parent to a question mark rather than to a fact. Hartwell told him what the truck had said. Frank Pilarski was 34 years old on November 2, 1974. Dennis was 30. Frank had put new front tires on the truck the week before because the old ones were showing wear, and he was not a man who deferred maintenance. Dennis had packed the sandwiches because Frank always forgot the food. They had a thermos of coffee between the seats and 11 years of the same November Saturday behind them and everything in the world to come home to. Helen and the girls, Carol and Michael, Sunday dinner on Tamarack Road, the small engine repair in Dennis's garage, the school bus route that started before dawn. The truck sat in covered storage in Bemidji for 49 years. It held what it knew. It waited for someone to ask with the right instruments, in the right language, with enough patience to hear the answer from metal that had been quiet for half a century. Roy Strand wrote in 1974 that the brakes should be evaluated. He was right. The evaluation came 49 years later, and it said what he suspected. And he had died in 2001 without knowing that his instinct had been correct, and that the note he filed had been the thing that eventually, in a grant cycle in 2022, became the engineering report that sent a sergeant to a care facility in Grand Rapids on a Thursday morning in May. Nothing in that chain was wasted. Nothing in that chain was redundant. Each piece of attention, Strand's note, Hartwell's 2018 flag, 4 years of waiting for a grant, Kowalski's spectroscopy, was a link that held, and the chain ran from a drainage ditch on Forest Road 2163 in November 1974 to a common room in Grand Rapids in May 2023, where a man who had been waiting to be asked finally said that he had wondered when someone would come. I want to leave you with 3 questions. Gerald Tofte was never prosecuted because of his cognitive state. 2 men died because of what he did in 1974. Does the inability to prosecute change what we owe to Frank, Dennis, and their families? And what does accountability look like when a perpetrator has outlived the capacity to be held accountable in a courtroom? Roy Strand filed a note about the brakes in 1974 and recommended a mechanical review that was never conducted. At what point does a failure to follow up on a filed recommendation become a systemic failure rather than a resource failure? And what would it take to ensure that the next Roy Strand's note gets acted on before another 49 years pass? And what does it mean that the truck, preserved in a state storage facility for nearly half a century, was the witness that ultimately told the truth? That physical evidence, properly kept, can outlast the people who created it, who investigated it, and who committed the crime it records. Justice found Frank and Dennis Pilarski after 49 years. It came through a note filed in 1974, a grant approved in 2022, and a forensic engineer who asked the right questions of a truck that had been waiting to answer them. Stories like theirs are why this channel exists. If you believe that physical evidence is its own kind of witness, one that does not forget and does not lie, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.